Welcome, Dr. Jörg Kukies, State Secretary in the German Chancellery. I will just very briefly introduce you because you are an exception under German politicians, and you have executive experience both in business and in administration. You've been for a long time with Goldman Sachs, and now you are in the federal government, first in the Ministry of Finance and now in the Chancellery with Mr. Scholz. But most important for us, you are our German Sherpa for the G7 and for the G20. Sherpa sounds always very laborious, you know.
It is.
Probably. And I would like you to share your insights on what can be done in G7 and G20. What are the major problems and what are the differences? Because from my perspective, one, the G7, you are among friends to some extent at least, partners, you share the same values with everyone. But in the G20, you are among a lot of important countries and governments, and some of them are even identified as opponents, competitors, adversaries of G7 countries, particularly of the US. Yeah, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. No, many thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak and to expand a little bit on how the work in the G7 and the G20 relate to trade and tech, which is the topic of the conference. Of course, 2022 was marked by a lot of other things, and especially the Russian aggression against Ukraine, of course, occupied most of the time, rightly so, of the G7. And of course, the debate in the G20 was made harder and difficult. We, I think, achieved a very good result in Bali at the end. But of course, the controversies in the G20 are more difficult by the nature of the much broader membership than the G7. That's pretty obvious. But at the end, we still managed to find an outcome that clearly condemned the Russian aggression against Ukraine, and also in content delivered, I think, more than some had expected and more than some had feared. So in that sense, I think it was a good year in terms of the process and the progress of the G7 and the G20. And of course, we're now working hard to see the same results for the Japanese G7 and the Indian G20 presidency. So in that sense, the work has already started. Of course, we put the coordination on sanctioning Russia, coordinating the response of the G7 countries at the forefront of our G7 work last year. I think it keeps getting reiterated. The G7 mantra of providing financial, humanitarian, military and diplomatic support and stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes, I think has become a very commonly recognized point of agreement within the G7 that goes back to Elmau. I think for us equally important is what we did post Elmau, post the G7 summit. It's extremely important for us that we held a very successful conference on reconstruction of a post-war Ukraine in Berlin as a joint effort between the G7 and the European Union. That was done very, very consciously because on the one side, of course, we see it as a global responsibility, but on the other, given the importance of Ukrainian cooperation, integration, and accession to the EU, of course, both the G7 and the EU have a huge role to play in this recovery, reconstruction, and modernization. So, of course, we were very proud that at the end of our presidency, in the last video conference of the leaders, we set up the donor platform for Ukraine, where now we're getting a huge amount of public and private sector support to fund the reconstruction and the recovery of Ukraine, both with government funds within and outside of the G7, but equally important, also conceptualizing the ideas of how to crowd in private capital that will eventually flow into the reconstruction effort. So I think that's a very open, very important split. Of course, for us, equally important to avoid the kind of risk of conflict that we saw potentially arising, given differences in views to the evaluation of Russia's invasion against Ukraine, is the fact that we consciously made a point of inviting and involving the Global South to the G7 summit in Elmau. So the fact that countries that either abstained in the UN or didn't join the sanctions regime of the G7, such as India, Indonesia, South Africa, Senegal, Argentina, who are, of course, also a very heterogeneous group, but are certainly countries that we have to partner with and that we have to take on board in this process, all of which were enormously important for the process going from the G7 summit to the G20 summit. 4 of them, of course, being G20 members, Senegal in the dual role as a very important democracy of Africa, but also the African Union presidency, guest country of the G20 last year, was also vital in mobilizing and organizing the consensus that we reached in Bali. So I think there's a very logical progression, and a lot of what we did on the Global Alliance on food security, on the support to help the Istanbul agreements on facilitating grain exports from Russia and Ukraine with the destination of the Global South, also showed the Global South that we're serious when we say that, while we clearly have a policy of condemnation against Russia in the war and militarily support Ukraine, we also want to minimize the impact on the Global South of this war, and are even willing to work with Russia on this key question of fertilizers, of grain exports. And even though it's difficult and sometimes bumpy in terms of getting the grains out of the ports, it is actually working. And so in that sense, it is sort of an illustration, and the support in Bali for the Istanbul agreements also shows that even in a situation like the one we're in, we can find a minimum of humanitarian consensus. And that, I think, is also important. Now, over to the big topic of this conference, trade and tech. That, of course, plays a vital role in the evolution of the G7 and the G20 in this year. The Japanese presidency, of course, has a huge interest in this topic, and we fully support them with focusing on trade and technology in terms of the content that they will deliver in the G7. In terms of the priorities, the Japanese presidency has put economic security as a key element of their G7 priorities, and they are taking a very broad definition of economic security, namely all of the national security measures are a core component of this. So we have discussions on investment screening, on export control, on counter-espionage, counter-sabotage, anti-economic coercion measures. And many of the components we will discuss in a very broad way. And of course, all of those impact both the trade element and the technology element because of the work that we will be doing on resilience of supply chains, on building on the work that we've done in the German G7 presidency on this, also working with the OECD on this, I think will lead to a lot of very important debates. The idea behind this, of course, is that the economic activities and national security concerns can be very closely linked, and we can't have a narrow view of security focusing on the military aspect only, but we have to take the whole trade technology aspects into consideration when we think about national security. So I think that's something where we have these two words, economic and security, which sound like they have somewhat of a tension within them as a key priority of the G7. Actually makes a lot of sense to think about the interlinkage of the two. We also have the view to develop a positive narrative on this. So we do not want this to be creating the perception of a pure anti-China policy or narrative emerging. We want to have a more positive approach to this. So in that sense, thinking about strengthening the resilience of supply chains, I think, entails a lot of thinking about diversification. Of course, we as Germany, having gone through one of the biggest mistakes, both in public policy but also private investment decisions, on over-reliance on Russia as a source of energy, and seeing the massive adverse implications of that during the whole year of 2022, not only in terms of limiting the scope of our policymaking, but also economic cost to our society. We sort of are, a natural-born interlocutor for that debate on what we need to do in terms of diversification. So that is something that is very important for us. And also we want to have a positive narrative in the sense that once we tell our economy and our companies to diversify out of concentrated risks, we also have to tell them and support them in telling them what to diversify into. As every private sector risk manager knows, having a concentrated exposure is a bad thing, but not keeping it means you have to have somewhere else to go and to diversify your assets into. And translated into trade policies, that of course means that we have to massively accelerate the speed with which we conclude free trade agreements. And the European Union is, I think, picking up the momentum. I think Germany contributed. Also, one of my personal highlights of 2022 was the ratification of the trade agreement with your favorite country, as I just learned, Canada and the European Union, that had been in sort of nowhere land in Germany for far too many years. The fact that Germany is now ratifying it shows that we're making progress, and that has to be a motivation for us to think about Mercosur, Chile, where we just were 2 weeks ago, India, Indonesia, Australia, New Zealand. The amount of free trade agreements that we want to integrate into this positive narrative of diversifying is something that's extremely important, because it is a core element of the German economy, that while we were massively concentrated in terms of energy and made the mistake of consciously not diversifying sufficiently, for the economic aspect, that's not as easy to make as a point. If you look at the trade relationships of the entire Indo-Pacific, I would dare to venture, Germany tends to be top 3, at least top 5 trade partner to Indonesia, India, Philippines, Malaysia. I mean, if you look at the rank of Germany as a trade partner, we're actually quite high. So you can't say that the German economy is neglecting these. It's just the problem that the accessible market in China is so outsized that a certain concentration just merely comes from having a proportionate share in that market. So the big chance that we see is through reaching trade agreements, we can support the growth of trade overall with those markets. And of course, another positive narrative, let's stop complaining about the Belt and Road Initiative in the sense of only complaining. Let's take the initiative of the G7 last year on the partnership, the global partnership on infrastructure investment, and put a sustainable, fair counterbalance to that, and let's show to the world that we are, as the G7, willing and able to put hundreds of billions of euros and dollars into making sustainable infrastructure partnerships a real phenomenon. The same goes for the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, which we are building now as one of the other key priorities of the G7, to also put a positive narrative on what we are doing to diversify out of concentrated risks. And I think that's extremely important. in terms of the priorities that we have. It'll lead to a whole new export model for many countries. We were just in Argentina, Chile, and Brazil. All of these countries have vast potential for renewable energies. Even though we have a very ambitious program of expanding renewable energies in Germany, the estimates of all of the experts is we will still import, even if we're successful at 100% electricity from renewable energy in 2035, we will still need to import between 40 and 60% of our green hydrogen from the world. So that opens a whole new channel of trade to many, many countries who have favorable conditions for wind, solar, geothermal, hydro, and many other sources of energy. Turning finally to digital, one of the key elements that we want to do in tech is also to combine trade and tech in the discussions. The concept that was developed in data free flow with trust, I think, is an enormously important concept to avoid unilateral localization rules on data, to allow data to flow freely, but in a rules-based method where certainly the G7, hopefully at some point, the WTO, the G20 can also help with this in terms of facilitating a rules-based free flow of data where we have the rule set and the framework to allow this to happen. The concept, and that's why I'm very optimistic, was developed in 2019 during the G20, coming from Japan as an idea and a concept. So Japan, of course, is very focused on this now in their G7 presidency, and I think it's extremely important to have this concept of rulemaking and cross-border data flows, because, of course, much of what we're seeing in terms of protectionist trends is these stringent rules on data localization, which will prevent the free flow of data. So in that sense, I'm quite optimistic that Japan will use its G7 presidency, and everything that we've been starting to discuss now at the level of the Sherpas indicates that there will be a large focus on that. We're proud that in the, I would say, realm of less well-publicized achievements in the German G7 presidency, the concept that we developed of the action plan for promoting data-free flow with trust is something that now gives sort of a good framework for the Japanese G7 presidency to work on, operationalizing it further. We have the proposal of a secretariat permanently, so I think this is something that will evolve over time and help with exactly the topic of this theme, namely the trade tech conference, where you can see the combination of free flow of data, which is enormously important for the development of integrating and helping the growth of the tech sector with trade ideas. So that, I would say, are the key points, but happy to discuss them further as there's requests.
Thank you very much for your presentation. And yes, perfect timing, by the way. Now we'll start with one question, which is important at every Transatlantic conference, German-American conference. The most important topic always is China to some extent. And we've discussed China in depth this morning, yesterday, all the time. And I think you are, and German governments, European governments, in a certain tension between G7 and G20. You know, you can, from my perspective, you can find a lot of solutions also for the free flow of data, for some trade issues in the G7. And you can maybe include a lot of other countries into this. But you also have to deal with China, because they are not like Russia at the end of supply chains, but because they are completely intertwined in the whole economic system. What do you think? Is there an opportunity that we can reach deep agreements on this data security issues and also on intellectual property and so on with China as well?
Well, Of course, it's challenging. No doubt that there is quite a lot of real-world challenges to exactly and precisely these topics. We've seen some encouraging signs, but also some less encouraging signs. So I would say the verdict is out on whether, especially on these delicate themes, there's enough strength and power in the G20 to find agreement. I would say I mentioned some positive elements on the Bali summit where I really think we outperformed and did better than was expected or feared, however you want to say it. But there are some other elements that are very relevant to global trade where we performed less well. I would put the global debt issue at the forefront of that, where it was surprisingly to many possible to agree within the G20 on a consensus on the position on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. However, less well publicized, but to me very painful, was the inability to agree on a common language on the global debt crisis. I mean, of course, this is getting into a very sort of nerdy kind of discussion on footnotes, but the fact that one country consciously insisted on inserting a footnote that they do not agree with the G20 consensus, and it was a 19+1 consensus, is quite concerning, because the one country that insisted on this footnote is one of the largest creditors of the global south. And unfortunately, this is not a purely nerdy sort of exertion and investigation of a G20 text, which people like me spend 4 days and nights in windowless rooms on the island of Bali negotiating, but actually translates itself into a less consensual way to deal with debt problems, which, as many economic experts say, will probably get worse before they get better. So that is certainly a big impediment, I would say, to global cooperation. And that's something we're working on in many cases, of course, in all of the MDBs. But it is certainly an issue that makes me less optimistic. The same goes for an area where I was specifically disappointed that if you compare the Bali text with the Rome text a year earlier, we stepped down in ambition level, and that's on anti-corruption, where it was no longer possible to agree on the OECD consensus on anti-corruption. Why am I saying that in a reply to a question on trade and technology? If we can't agree within the G20 on principles that we were able to agree on that are so important for rule of law, for transparency, for fairness, for level playing fields as anti-corruption, and we have to go down in ambition level, it will be very hard to agree on things that on a global scale are probably even harder to find agreement and conceptualize, like free flow of data.
Okay, yeah.
And of course, if you can get into the minutiae of the ITO and all of the standard setting bodies, where it's also getting harder and harder to achieve consensus. So I think it's an ambitious program, and we really have to work hard to find this, but I would say there is still a huge amount of work to be done, and the trend at the moment is not clear whether it's unanimously positive at the moment.
What do you think about the future of G7, G20? G7 is to some extent clear who's member. G20 is somehow an extension, and somehow they are also adversaries of the West and so on. What do you think? Shouldn't there be a format in between?
So I find it amazingly positive that a few years after the legendary picture of the American president sitting like this, and the whole global community of leaders sitting on the other side of the table looking puzzled. You're saying that it's so obvious that the G7 works and is clear and is positive,
okay,
right? So it's not a foregone conclusion, I would say. There's still a lot of recent history that the G7 wasn't always the sort of the epicenter of harmony. So it's very good, and of course we're very proud that we achieved this consensus, but that's also not a foregone conclusion. If you look at the unity and the willingness of the entire G7 to take resolute action on all of the adjectives that I mentioned, from military to financial, macro-financial to humanitarian, on the Ukraine, that was also not a foregone conclusion, that this uniformness of response of the G7 to Russia's invasion would automatically happen. And I think if you compare the resoluteness with which we acted to prior instances of Russian aggression, it is something that we see how important this resoluteness is, because potentially the fact that the G7 didn't react as strongly to other acts of Russian aggression put in Putin's mind a false perception that we wouldn't be able to do so in 22. Of course, all of that is speculation, and there's many people who are much more capable than me of evaluating that. But I do think we shouldn't sort of have a lazy consensus that, you know, all the work in the G7 is done and it'll always be smooth sailing. And on the other side, of course, the G20 needs to focus on the fundamental things that matter. I mean, the fact that we also, as a core takeaway from the G7, have the foundation of an open and inclusive climate club is an area which opens the door to the G20, right? I mean, I think everyone agrees that in terms of solving the problems of climate neutrality, nobody can think that we will achieve that without China, without India, without Indonesia, without Nigeria, and all of these countries that are either large and therefore large emitters to start with, say China, or that are growing so fast in population that, of course, with the combination of growing wealth and population, if they don't work with us on decarbonization, climate neutrality will simply not work. Even if we turn into climate neutral, if the fast-growing countries, both demographically and in terms of per capita wealth, don't do so in partnership with us in a climate neutral way, we simply won't achieve these goals. And the Climate Club is our conceptual ideas to, instead of tagging ourselves with carbon border adjustment mechanisms that then trigger adjustment mechanisms in other countries, we want a cooperative way of thinking. And the big challenge this year in the G20 and beyond will be to move this concept out of the G20, where we now have consensus, and invite other members to join. And we were, of course, thrilled in our Latin America trip that many Latin America countries are already joining this initiative.
Okay, thank you very much. But I would go a little bit further on this question. How can we attract better partners? Partners you've already mentioned, like Brazil, Argentina, Indonesia, so on, because they are somehow, in economic relations at least, in between China and the West.
Yep.
And I very often have the feeling that the West tries to bring them in a position where they have to make a decision between China and the West. And from my perspective, that's not the best way forward, I think, because they do not want to make a decision. They want to take the best from both sides. Would you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons why the G7 presidency made a conscious decision to involve India, Indonesia, Senegal, South Africa, Argentina is precisely this thinking, to avoid, other countries would have aligned easier and quicker with the sort of consensus in the G7 than the countries that I mentioned, but we consciously said to avoid this sort of split in the G20 and the perception that the G7 is acting only together with like-minded countries, we consciously made the I would say, in terms of agreeing on the resilient democracy statement, harder choice of involving other countries, namely the 5 that I mentioned. And I think that's sort of going in the direction of our thinking. Much was made in the media when we had the press conference between Chancellor Olaf Scholz and President Lula on the divergence of evaluations of the Russian aggression against Ukraine. I'm surprised that the press or the public was surprised. I mean, what President Lula said was completely consistent with what he's been saying for months and months and months, so there was no surprise in that. What I found deeper and more insightful in terms of understanding the thinking was the elements that he mentioned in the bilateral conversations, but then also in the press conference, on what are the elements that will make him support the Mercosur agreement. And he was very clear on this. He said, A, Europe has to rethink its stance on agriculture and be less protectionist on agriculture. But he also said, and this is quite interesting, he said this as the man who just won the election against Bolsonaro on a platform of protecting the Amazon, of stopping aggressive deforestation, of stopping overstretching the use of deforested areas for agriculture. He also said in the press conference that the European Union should reconsider its deforestation legislation just introduced, because from the perspective of the global South, this is going too far in terms of demanding protection only. Because as he said, we have a lot of people in Brazil who need subsistence. So I think, and the other part, by the way, that doesn't come across well in the global South is the combination of sanctioning or overstretching the point of sanctioning in trade agreements violations of sustainability rules. Because, of course, in the global South, the perception, and President Lula in the press conference made that very clear, threatening us with sanctions on rules that you have made without our involvement is not a level playing field. So I think, you know, to get these things across the line and to get deeper alignment between, let's say, EU and Mercosur, but this is just one example of many. When you listen to speeches of Modi or Widodo, you hear similar points made in public. A final point that I would make is the question of commodities and raw materials. Being too free trade on those things is perceived in the global South. And again, the press conference that I mentioned is a good example of that, as extractionist only.
Yes.
So, of course, the owners of plots of land that have lithium in the ground and copper and nickel and many other things will not be happy with global companies coming to their country, taking the raw materials out of the earth and taking it elsewhere for further processing. Of course they want more parts of the value creation in their country. And a purely sort of free trade in the economic perfectionist view of the world is simply not acceptable for them. Because they say, of course we need to give economic incentives for local production, but seeing failed models of development that were based on extractionism leads countries in the global south to say we need to insist on more value creation in our own countries. And I think if we don't accept that, then the trend towards achieving more and more free trade agreements simply will not work.
Thank you very much for your insights. As I understand, you are a cautious optimist on the G20, right?
Yes,
yes.
That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, okay. Then thank you very much for your insights and for being with us in your very, very tight schedule you have to follow. Yeah, and thank you very much. You and yeah. So.